Opportunities in the Marketplace by Victor Yup and Doris Mock. Chapter 10. Saul, the Evil Eye. 1 Samuel chapter 18. A cartoon on the internet has a kung fu master saying to his student, "I know 1,000 ways to kill a man. I will teach you 999, because one day I may have to use the last way on you." For centuries, the kung fu master, the samurai generals, and the grand master physicians do not teach their students everything they know for fear that one day the students' skills, knowledge, and expertise might top, overtake, and surpass the teacher himself. The Chinese sayings detrimental to the master include: first, the student triumph over his master; second, the back waves pushing the front waves; and third, the color green that comes from blue overpowering the color blue. Every teacher is afraid that his student might pull the plank after they have crossed the bridge. For example, a wise kung fu teacher withholds a trick or two from the disobedient student to throw him for a loop, bring him to his knees, or put him in his place. Rare is the master who graciously transfers the entirety of his secret manuscripts, fighting techniques, and martial arts to his student. A benevolent teacher might do it if the student marries his daughter. Often, if the teacher cannot pass the killer blow to his children, he would rather take it to the grave than to benefit those outside the family. Rare is the closed-door student who trains with the master for more than 10 years, not the master's son or daughter. Saul, the king, was jealous of David, the man who would be king, and he did all that was in his power to stop David from making his mark, taking his place, and gaining the respect, the loyalty, and the affection of the people. However, the more he tried, the more popular David became. Shakespeare called jealousy a green-eyed monster. The Germans associate pale with jealousy. The Swedes become black sick with jealousy, and the Chinese go red with jealousy. The word jealous comes from the word zeal. A jealous person guards everything with excessive zeal, whether it is his status, his secret, or his success. The jealous person is afraid that someone else is going to steal something from him or her. Why is jealousy negative, unfulfilling, and self-defeating? What causes people to be possessive and protective of power? How can we be more caring and sharing to others around us? First, people become defensive when they are jealous. 1 Samuel 18, 5-9. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. A young boy traveled across Japan to the school of a famous martial artist. When he arrived, he was given an audience by the sensei. "What do you want from me?" the master asked. "I wish to be your student and become the finest karateka in the land," the boy replied. "How long must I study?" 10 years at least," the master answered. 10 years is a long time," said the boy. "What if I studied twice as hard as all your other students?" 20 years, replied the master. 20 years? What if I practiced day and night with all my effort? 30 years, was master's reply. "How is it each time I say I will work harder, you tell me that it will take longer?" the boy asked. The answer is clear. When one eye is fixed upon your destination, there is only one eye left with which to find the way. A sports saying suggests, "A mad player is a bad player." The rise of David and the opposition from Saul was literally an eye-opener in the text. Jewish eyes were smiling on David. The word pleased, verse 5, is the Hebrew noun for sight, but Saul watched David as if his life depended on it. He kept a jealous eye on David, verse 9. The NIV used the word eye as a noun, but the Hebrew text recorded it as a verb. Saul eyed David from that day on. This is the only time, the first and last time, the eye is used as a verb in the Bible. Saul was probably the most jealous biblical character. His jealousy knew no bounds and had no limits. For what reason did Saul give David the jealous eye and the evil eye? For no reason or fault of David. David never asked to be invited home, verse 2, and never took matters into his own hands or offered suggestions on how to govern, who to fight, or what to do. He obediently did what Saul sent him to do, verse 5. Success did not change David. He was not tired of or disgusted with playing harp for the king. David followed Saul like a puppy, but Saul eyed him like a hawk. Here was an eager and loyal young man who was willing to put his life on the line and even take an arrow or a spear for his king and master. David's crimes and threats were his talents, gifts, and abilities. The verb behaved wisely, verse 14 of King James Version, or success in NIV, appears more in this chapter than any chapter in the Bible, characterizing and capturing David's behavior. He behaved himself wisely, verse 5. He behaved himself wisely in all his ways, verse 14. He behaved himself very wisely, verse 15. And David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, verse 30. David's success, verse 5, was not a curse. It was a blessing that Saul compelled, corrupted, and changed into a curse. The unranked soldier did not do anything wrong or shameful, nor was he out of line or out of order. David did not champion himself, court success, or curry favors. Even when he was promoted, no one protested. All the citizens applauded the king's actions, and uncharacteristically, even the overlooked soldiers and the officers were happy for Saul, David, and the nation too. No soldier was on strike. They beamed with pride at David's coming of age, and they did not take offense at David's rapid rise. One day, however, it all went wrong. The women who had come from all the towns of Israel said the wrong thing and sang the wrong chorus. The verb dance or play is in the intensive peel stem, verse 7. Their song was not music to Saul's ears. The fact that they were there to meet and greet King Saul, verse 6, and not David, did not make the king happier or better with the lyrics ringing in his ears. Saul nearly fell off his high horse. It was one of those repeat till the 9th time, sing till you are breathless, the mouth is dry, and the voice is coarse praise songs. Although they did not repeat David his tens of thousands more times than Saul has slain his thousands and David his hundreds, but the ladies kicked off quite a storm, rained on Saul's parade, and added fuel to the fire. Is David 10 times the man I am? Saul snorted. Saul became not just angry, but very angry. The kind of fury or intense anger that led Cain, Genesis 4:5, and Jacob's sons, Genesis 34:7, to kill, Abner to betray Ishbosheth, 2 Samuel 3:8, David to burn upon hearing Nathan's story, 2 Samuel 12:5, Nehemiah to condemn the slavery of fellow Jews, Nehemiah 5:6, and Jonah to pout when Nineveh was spared, Jonah 4:1. This noticeable anger remained unabated, and recurring phrase remained with Saul the next 2 chapters, 1 Samuel 20, verse 7, even when David was out of his life and presence. King Saul knew how popular the song would become after the ladies from all the towns of Israel, verse 6, had learned and spread it. It was as good as burning his eyebrows, shaving his mustache, and slapping his face. However, Saul did not take out his displeasure on the ladies, but on David. From the word they, Saul ended with the words he, verse 8. Every word David said and every move he made were viewed with suspicion. Everything Saul saw afterwards was clouded by impairment, colored with intention, and clothed with insidiousness. Second, people become destructive when they are jealous. 1 Samuel 18:10-17. The next day an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in the campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." Matt Weinstein, in his book Managing to Have Fun, tells of an amazing psychology experiment nicknamed the Good Samaritan Study. Researchers noticed that payphone customers like to check the coin return slot for money after making a call, so they decided to test how those with and those without their money returned respond to people in need. The researchers randomly put coins in the coin return slot so that some of the people who used the phone actually did discover money. The researchers then hired a young woman to walk by the phone at the exact moment that the subjects were hanging up. When the young woman walked by with her arms full of books, she pretended to stumble and drop them on the ground. Astonishingly, the researchers observed that the people who found the money in the coin return were 4 times as likely to stop and help the woman pick up her books than were the people who found no money in the coin return. They concluded that people tend to do good when they feel good. It's been said, how a man plays the game shows something of his character. How he loses shows all of it. Saul's destruction began when he became volatile, vindictive, and vicious. Also, he had much time on his hands to brood, to fret, and to mope. He decided that one of them had to go. The initial love Saul had for David, 1 Samuel 16:21, was replaced by murderous hate, and he erupted into uncontrollable rage and violence. How dare somebody steal my limelight and scenes? How dare the supporting actors steal the show, win the Oscar, and garner the reviews? David's ratings were up, his star was rising, and his fans were growing. Someone had to pay, something had to give, someone had to go, and something had to be done. The vicious king lashed out in rage and threw a spear at David. He threw it with all his might, thinking of making kebab and mince meat out of David. Venom leaked and dripped from Saul's mouth. Saul was no better than the Gentile Goliath who, not coincidentally, carried a spear, 1 Samuel 17:7. In a sense, he was even more dangerous than Goliath, who had no chance to throw his spear. It is remarkable the verb hurl, verse 11, was not used previously in the Bible. The king kept thinking, "I'll get him next time." No wonder a psychiatrist said, "I can cure somebody's madness, but I can't do anything about the person's badness." David's refusal to defend himself against the spear the second time still did not convince Saul of his innocence. The verb play, verse 10, in the intensive PL stem, verse 10, describes David's tireless and touching effort. Fear, verse 12, and more fear, verse 29, made Saul an ugly and unstable person. The phrase "more afraid" is a rare entry in the Bible. His fear was unfounded and misplaced. He made David his enemy the rest of his days, verse 29, instead of the Philistines, verse 25. Saul targeted the wrong person. He should be more afraid of himself. He did not face up to the Lord's absence in his life, but fumed at the Lord's presence in David's life. Saul did not rail against God, but David. David did not cause Saul's problems. He was there to calm them. Note that the Spirit of the Lord was with David, 1 Samuel 16:13, before departing from Saul, 1 Samuel 16:14, not after. The more Saul persecuted David, the more David thrived. The young lad had great success because the Lord was with him, verse 14. What was spoken twice of Saul, 1 Samuel 10:7 and 20:13, God is with you, was mentioned a record-breaking 8 times with David, 1 Samuel 16:18, 17:37, 18:12, 14, 28, 20 verse 13, 2 Samuel 5:10, and 7:31, as confirmed by Saul's young servant, a youth, 1 Samuel 16:18. Saul, a leader, 1 Samuel 18:28. Jonathan, a peer, 1 Samuel 20 verse 13, and Nathan, a mentor, 2 Samuel 7:3. Saul had invoked God's blessing upon David, 1 Samuel 17:37, for the latter's fight with Goliath, but sadly he did not mean it. Maybe he meant it only to his advantage, or he had reversed himself. Saul misled David to fight for him with 2 persistent and persuasive imperatives, verse 17, serve and fight, but with no success. God's presence in David's life did little to deter Saul from acting irrationally, even as the Lord gave David unparalleled success. The word all characterized David's success. First, his promotion pleased all the people, verse 5. Then the ladies from all the towns of Israel went gaga over him, verse 6. Later, he had success in all he did, verse 14. Eventually, all Israel and Judah, north and south, would come to love him, verse 16, because David risked his life for them. David was fighting in the battlefield with them while Saul was lounging in the palace. Both Israel and David united for the first time in the new land, 1 Samuel 17:52 and 18 verse 16, for a person rather than a cause. Third, people become deceitful when they are jealous, 1 Samuel chapter 18 verses 25 to 30. Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other prize for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king, so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. The Walt Disney tandem of Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg brought magic and money to the kingdom before they split, the latter founding DreamWorks as a result, and the former never the same since. 2 months after CEO Michael D. Eisner had an operation, the corporate world was shocked by Katzenberg's resignation rather than promotion. Katzenberg had success overseeing 40 films a year and was credited with the huge success of Disney's animation, including The Lion King, but Eisner refused to name him as the number 2 man at Disney. Katzenberg complained bitterly, "For 19 years, Michael has been my mentor, teacher, number 1 champion, my boss, and my friend. I just wanted him to take me as his partner, to bring me to his inner circle. I did not want his job. I was prepared to be his number 2 guy. This as a teacher and a student, and now the student asked to be a teacher's assistant. It's about a father not being able to accept his son. I still don't understand it, and it's hard to reconcile." Succession scares leaders. Only 34% of the chief executives say they have identified their successors, concludes a recent survey by Korn Ferry International, an executive research firm in New York. Some people gracefully accept others' success only when they themselves are successful. Some react strongly when others have more success. Some bring out the worst in themselves when their stock is down and others are up. No matter what Saul did to David, David did not go away. The latter had more success, more support, and more self-respect. David survived spears, snares, and setbacks. His progress report in the chapter reads this way: Jonathan loved David as himself, verse 1. All Israel and Judah loved David, verse 16. Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, verse 20 and 28. And Saul's attendants like, or Hebrew for love, him, verse 22. Everyone on Saul's side, his son, his daughter, his subjects, and his servants loved David. Jonathan, 1 Samuel 18, verse 1 and 20, verse 17, and Michal's, verses 20 and 28, love for David were each mentioned twice in the Bible. Saul's love was selfish. Initially, Saul loved David greatly more than anyone else's love for David. He loved David. The word like, 1 Samuel 16:21, is Hebrew for love, but others were not allowed to share the love. Saul would love David as long as it did not cost him anything, as long as David stayed in his rightful place, and as long as others did not feel the same way. Still, David's success, 1 Samuel 18:5, 14, 15, and 30, behaved wisely, King James Version, was unequivocal. Not only did David have success in whatever Saul sent him to do, verse 5, the Hebrew text says that he had success in all the ways he did it, verse 14, and more success, the word more, missing in NIV, verse 15, and he had more success than the rest of Saul's officers, verse 30. David's success bred fear in Saul. More success bred more fear, verse 29. Nothing went right for Saul. Even the Lord's presence bred fear in Saul, verses 12 and 28. David's success bred fear in him, verse 15, and his daughter's love for David bred fear in him. When Saul asked for 100 dead Philistines as dowry, verse 25, David produced 200, verse 27. Saul's downhill spiral was clear. When he acted on his initial fear of David, verse 12, the fear did not go away, verse 15, and by the end of the chapter he was more afraid of David than ever, verse 29. Saul was not only angry, he was very angry or furious. Fire covered his eyes. Now Saul not only feared David, he dreaded him. There was no rhyme or reason in Saul's fear. David was not even the highest-ranking official, verse 5, and Saul never placed more than 1,000 soldiers under him, verse 13. The irony is inescapable. Saul started out very angry, verse 8, but ended up more afraid, verse 29. But David became successful, verse 14, more successful in Hebrew, verse 15, and ended up well known or very known in Hebrew, verse 30, the last word marking its debut in the Bible. Saul's rise brought joy to the kingdom, 1 Samuel 11:15, but David's rise brought love and affection. No matter how much he tried to bring David down, David was still standing. Saul used and manipulated the Lord's name in vain, verse 17. The Philistines as weapons, verses 17 and 25. His older daughter as leverage, verse 17. His youngest daughter as bait, verse 21. His servants as accomplice, verses 22 and 24. In Hebrew, the word bravely, verse 17, consists of two words, valiant and son. Saul urged David to fight like a son for his father, verse 17. Saul kept a keen eye on David and a spear in his hand, verse 10. Yet he could not keep a handle on his life unraveling. His methods were heavy-handed. 3 times he entertained the thought of David's death at the hands of the Philistines, verses 17, 21, and 25. David played with his hand, as the Hebrew records, verse 10, to heal, but Saul hurled from his hand to kill. Conclusion. The biblical teaching model, relationship, and principles are always the best. Do you build people up and bring the best out of them? Jesus orders the church to make disciples of all nations in his last address to them and to teach them to obey everything God has commanded. Matthew 28:20. Paul challenges, "You, then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself?" Romans 2:21. Do you pass the baton? 2 Timothy 2 verse 2 says, "The things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others." Bible study questions. 1. List the repetitions related to David in the Scriptures, verses 5, 12, 14, 15, and 30. The 2 important characteristics of David are: 2. List the reason for David's popularity, verse 5. 3. How do people compare Saul and David in the lyrics, verses 6 to 7? 4. Why was Saul angry? Was it reasonable for him to be displeased with the words of the people? Verse 8. 5. Saul became jealous and eyed David. How was he affected by the demon's sins? Verse 10. 6. Also, why did this demon come from God? What responsibility did Saul himself have? 7. What action did Saul take with his jealousy against David? Verse 11. 8. Apart from jealousy, what emotional reaction did Saul have to David? Why? Verses 12 and 15. 9. What new methods did Saul have to deal with David? Verse 13. 10. Compare how the people and how Saul treated David. How the people treated David. How Saul treated David. 11. Describe the change in the relationship between Saul and David. Where was the turning point? Group sharing. 1. In the workplace, who are the people most welcomed and favored by their superiors and subordinates as well? Why? 2. In the workplace, who are most likely to be jealous? Why? 3. Is it the same in church ministry? What kind of personal characteristics do we look for in ministry? 4. How has this lesson helped you as a disciple of Christ to understand your role, identity, participation, influence, and relationship with others in the marketplace? Personal application. 1. In the workplace, how do you feel when you see others excelling and getting along with others? How do you feel? Do you act on these feelings? 2. If you do things well and have good interpersonal relationships, but is discriminated by your boss because of his jealousy, how would you feel and how would you deal with it? 3. In work or church ministry, when you feel that God is leaving you and with others or blessing them, how would you feel and how would you deal with it? 4. As an ordinary member in the workplace or church ministry, what persons would you follow? Is it important to be smart or to walk with God?